Thanks so much, and welcome, Dr. Lundgren.
All right. Do you have that walking mic?
Oh, yeah.
There it is.
And the slide mover forward does work.
Yeah. All right, do I have to turn this on?
Yes.
All right. Here we go again. Thanks. You guys have stuck with this all day. That's amazing. Your perseverance is admirable. We're going to talk about data. Lots of graphs now, which is what everybody wanted to see and hear, right? So regen ag, I think, is a viable solution. We are demonstrating that this works. So we hear the anecdotes, right? We hear the success stories, and those are critical, right? Those are absolutely critical. But they are also easily swept aside sometimes by saying that, you know what, that may be on your operation, but it'll never work on mine. And that's where science can step in. And we can show that, no, you know what, this works all the time. Or it works this percentage of the time. And it works under these circumstances, right? So that is what we're going to talk about more. Let's see. There it is. What is regenerative ag? I think Daniel mentioned it there a little bit. Within the scientific field, we're kind of slowly trailing behind the farmers that are developing regenerative systems. But you are starting to see this word popping up into the scientific literature more and more often. In a nutshell, I think it's got 4 elements. You're increasing soil health, promoting life. Biodiversity is life, while growing nutritious food profitably. So that's 4 elements, right? You got soil health, you got life, you've got nutrition, nutritious food, and you've got profit. It was originally coined back in 1983, this term regenerative agriculture, and then it kind of disappeared. I mean, every once in a while you hear about it here and there, but Robert Rodale is the one who came up with it. And then suddenly in 2018, there was 1 or 2 papers that started to come out, and ours was one of them, that actually started to test regenerative systems. And then we've got now some science that's trying to help define what regenerative agriculture is, okay, based on term usage and stuff like that. But if you use these ideas, I think these are pretty universally present in many of the definitions that you're going to hear on this topic. Soil carbon starts to play a role in this, doesn't it? So we start hearing these words too: water and the desertification of Boulder County. We start to talk about farm resilience as elements of this definition. Price premiums. All of these end up kind of falling within this these are artifacts of these wonderful aspects of this definition, okay? Regenerative agriculture is not unified by practices, it is unified by principles, all right? And, you hear, again, you'll hear, depending on who you're talking to, you'll hear different principles. But I like these 5. And I think that, we could all duke it out, but I think we're all on the same side for the most part, I think, on these. You got to stop tillage, all right? Tillage, if I've got to choose between an herbicide application and a tillage event in order to maintain my weeds, I'm gonna go herbicides. That's a polarizing statement. But from the long-term goals of what a regenerative system is supposed to establish, tillage is so much more damaging to life and the productivity of your system than a pesticide application is. Luckily, we have a lot more tools than that. And personally, I prefer to focus the dialogue on those other tools than either tillage or herbicides, which we don't use on our own farm. Never leave bare soil. There should always be living roots on the ground, okay? And plant diversity. We've heard this several times today, and this is such an important component. The energy for the system comes from the sun. You got to have plants out there. All groups of biological organisms scale directly, their diversity, their abundance, the biomass, scales directly with how many plants are in a habitat. I mean, ecologically, we can measure this over and over and over again in the ecological literature. So you gotta have plants out there. Livestock, what an incredibly valuable tool, not only from a farm business perspective, but also as a tool for managing other elements of the farm. And then I think that there needs to be this fifth one, and it reduce or eliminate synthetic agrochemicals. All right. The problem that we run into is, I mean, so that's fine. That's what regenerative agriculture is, debatably. That's what regenerative agriculture is. Okay, so I just walked onto a farm. Is this one regenerative? That definition doesn't help, does it? I mean, is it doing enough good things? Oh, well, this one, it's got canola and maybe there's some other cover crops planted. This is Canada, by the way, where we did a lot of work this last summer. My God, acres and acres of canola. It's beautiful. But is it enough? Is this farm regenerative or not? And this is a different question than just defining what is regenerative agriculture. Now we have to get into some nuts and bolts. How do you say this farm is regenerative, this one is not? The trouble becomes, and this is becoming more and more apparent, I don't know whether you guys are experiencing this, but boy, we sure hear about it. I'd say about once a month I get contacted by somebody who's come up with a new scoring system. Oh, we're going to help to define, so a farmer can know whether they are a regenerative farm or not. And so we've come up with this brilliant scoring system. It's going to be 52 pages long, and we're going to have all kinds of questions. We're going to get into every aspect of the farm, and then they will know they're going to have a score, right? And then we can label things based on that score. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The problem is that, number one, it's often not practical, right? I'm a farmer. I don't have time for 52-page questionnaire. What's the incentive for me there? And then the other element of that is that none of them are being validated. I mean, is anybody actually putting data behind, did this scoring system? I had a higher score than this other gal or guy. Does that mean my farm is attaining some regenerative goal at a greater rate? Nobody's got data. And then what ends up also happening is we're starting to hear about other corporate, interests that are starting to say, well, we're regenerative. Bayer Crop Science is regenerative now. And this is a regenerative dairy. I just saw that. I'm like, boy, we got to get ahead of this. Because I have a feeling, I'm about 70% sure that by the time we save the planet using our food system, we won't be calling it regenerative anymore. I just think that the name is becoming polluted at a pretty rapid clip. And we're really trying to put some chops behind that word, but at the end of the day, we'll probably be calling it something different. So let's focus on the mission instead of a lot of the fluff. Claire, you may recall Claire and her corn study. We had to do this, right? And I don't like labeling schemes very much. I like knowing your farmer. I think that's pretty incorruptible, knowing who your farmer is. Much less corruptible than a labeling scheme. But yet we were thrust into this world, okay, now we're working on regenerative versus conventional corn farms. How do we define one versus the other. And so we were forced to kind of come up with basically a scoring system. But what was nice about it is that now we've spent almost $1 million validating this scoring system in systems all across the country. And the scoring system may not be perfect, but it actually works. It predicts what regenerative agriculture is supposed to do. And so we published on that now. So anyways, there's that. So what did we do? Number one, we kept it simple. I like simple, right? In biology, or maybe in science in general, we call it parsimony. What's the simplest way of attaining a particular goal? Okay, so a parsimonious solution is what we were looking for within this system. So in croplands, we distilled it down to, I think, 9 yes or no questions that basically, when we walk onto a farm, within 5 minutes, we can give you a regenerative score that will predict soil carbon levels, life on your farm, how much water you're infiltrating, economics, so many different elements of it. 5 minutes. These questions are very straightforward. Did you till last year? Did you use any herbicides, fungicides, fertilizers, or insecticides? Did you put cover crops down there? How about organic amendments? Do you manage your field margins, and did you put any animals out there? Yes and no. Boom, you're done. In rangeland, it gets to be even easier. We distilled that down to 4 questions. Did you use any porons? How about chemical fertilizers? Okay. Did you keep your animals tight? Did you move them? How often did you move them? And how long did you let it rest? And based on those 4 elements, you can make some extremely powerful predictions on plant biomass production, on soil health metrics, so many different elements of that system. Very simple. We don't need 52 pages. For this to work, for a scoring system, there's the paper, by the way. It's publicly accessible, it's all open access. For this system to work, it's gotta be simple. Nobody's gonna use it if it's complicated. And it doesn't have to be complicated, right? It's gotta be transparent so that it can't be corrupted, all right? It's gotta work. It's gotta scale from 3 acres up to 1,000 acres. It's got to be transferable. It's got to work in Colorado. It's got to work in the Central Valley of California. It's got to work in the Piedmont up in Pennsylvania, right? And it's got to be replicable. It has to work again and again and again, okay? So we did that. This is total soil carbon, and this is the number of regenerative practices. The more regenerative practices, the greater your soil carbon. It isn't a great fit, but it's predictable and it's significant. Soil health, this is the Haney soil test score. More regenerative practices, the higher your soil health score is. What does the Haney soil test score mean? We're not entirely sure yet, but certainly it correlates with other elements of the system. Okay. Rangelands. In rangelands, the higher your regenerative matrix score, which is the fancy way of the number of regenerative practices you use, the more biomass you're producing on your rangelands. That's a good thing, right? Invertebrates, critters, same deal. Profit. The more regenerative practices you use on your farm, the more money you make. That's good, right? That's what we want to be showing. Why do these farms work? Well, if I had to narrow it down into 2 things, they increase life on the farm, that's soil carbon, and they reduce disturbance. But diversity is inherent here, right? And diversity comes not only in biology, right? What other sources of diversity should we be incorporating into our farms? Cultural diversity, for sure. Revenue streams, right? Yeah. What's a disturbance to a farm? A drought's a pretty good disturbance, yeah. What else? Tillage, that's a big one, yeah. Pardon? Chemicals, yeah. Agrochemicals are a disturbance. I was talking with our research team, and this is what I say, right? We got to reduce disturbance. And then finally, my students are like, after a certain point, though, John, I don't think we want to reduce disturbance anymore. That would lead to a late successional community, and that actually leads to lower diversity. You want disturbance. I'm like, gosh, darn it, you're absolutely right. But I don't think we're there yet, on our agroecosystems. But certainly we do need to be thinking about that. So I do kind of put a caveat on this. We need punctuated disturbance. We need to eliminate uniform disturbances. On our own farm, what is a disturbance? A good one, pigs. Oh my gosh. There's no better punctuated disturbance than getting some pigs out there. Anyways. So those are some of the overlying reasons why biodiversity works and why regenerative farms work. Biodiversity. So you may have seen something similar to this before, but just all of the life that is in 1 square meter of soil, right? So many different taxa, the most of which we can't even see, okay? It defies our ability to measure with our human senses. But we know it when we see it. We've measured biodiversity. We have, you don't get published in Science and Nature by publishing bioinventories, by going out and cataloging life in agroecosystems. It should have been done 100 years ago. It doesn't exist. It's very rare that you find true bioinventories of natural or of managed ecosystems. But we've done it. It's a heck of a lot of work. That's why. All right. From cornfields in eastern South Dakota, we've identified 482 bug species. In soybeans of South Dakota, 126 species of just predatory insects, 103 species in wheat. Cattle dung has more diversity than soybean fields. How about that? Cow poop, right? So there's actually a lot of biodiversity that's out there, but it is, in cornfields, this is 1/4 of what we find in the native prairies that used to be there. And we've done that inventory too. So even though we have a lot of life, it's not enough. Think of how much life you have to be encouraging on your farm, okay? That's a lot. Biological networks. So when you have that kind of species quantity, how on earth do you figure out how this leads to ecosystem services for that life to actually perform things for you, right? How on earth do you do that? When everything is connected with everything else, right? John Muir quote. Well, our understanding of biological networks, so that is essentially food webs. You can think of food webs as a network, right? We went back through and used, we use fancy-dancy statistical methods for understanding networks to understand, this is why Facebook knows who you've been talking to. And this is why Google can hone a new search for you. We use the same statistics that they did to try to understand why it is that we do or don't have pests when we have complex biological networks within agroecosystems. So simplified systems are one way for us to perceive the natural world, to make us feel like we're in control, right? But it ignores the complexity of the biological communities and those unforeseen interactions. So we went through, this is an interaction network of all of the insect species in South Dakota corn. Look at that. What a hairball. You know what a pain in the ass this was to create? 53 cornfields. We counted every bug that we found, right? And when there was a numerical association with it, we drew a line between them. So let's say number 80 is the pest. Number 80. Oh, maybe that's the corn rootworm. Ooh, we hate that one, right? We, as managers, as corn farmers, we need to kill number 80. Look at that sucker. Let's focus all of our attention on that one species. That's how we perceive biodiversity, isn't it? Let's focus all of our attention on that one disease organism. Let's focus all of our attention on that weed. But what we do is that we ignore the fact that number 80 over here is connected to species that are connected to species that are connected to species, right? And when and our decisions have probably so many effects on the rest of those species that are interacting. And really, at the end of the day, the abundance of number 80 is directly correlated with how many other interactions are going on in that cornfield. This is where we need to be managing, not here. And that actually works. Each dot is a cornfield. This is species diversity. This is how many species are it's an index, right? H. And so that's how many insect species are out there. And this is how many pests. More pests, less pests. As species diversity goes down, you have more pests. As the relative number of these species goes down, that's where your pests come in. How do you increase insect diversity? Any ideas? How do you keep habitat, right? Yep. How do you reduce insect diversity? Buy a jug. Doesn't matter what it says on the side of the jug. It all kills bugs. Okay? By buying jugs, you're increasing the number of pests that you have. Bottom line. This is, so I took that big hairball, right? And I pulled out the major components of it. This is a cornfield here that has no pests. Very low pest abundance. Look at all the connections that are going on in this thing, right? It's like a ball of spaghetti noodles. This is a cornfield that has high pest abundance. Where did all the connections go? There's even a pentagram. That's a sign of the devil. Right? We don't want that. I presented that out in California, and a lady came up to me afterwards, and she's like, actually, that is not the sign of the devil. I'm a witch. And I'm like, oh my goodness, there's one in every crowd. Didn't I work for you in USCA? Anyways, this is the average degree. So the connectivity, the more connected you are, the fewer pests you have. The less connected you are, the more pests you have. We have been waiting all day, John, for somebody to put up a steaming pile of poop. Well, wait no longer. All right? This is, we're going to talk about crap for a while. Dung. All of that stuff from cornfields also applies to poop. There is a lot of species that live in cattle dung. This is just the U.S. This is insects. We often think of dung beetles, right? A lot of people think of dung beetles. Yeah. Do you know what these are? Yeah. There's actually a lot more insect diversity living in dung than there is just dung beetles. But there is 30,000 species of dung beetles worldwide, and we have quite a few of them in North America. They don't all just eat cow poop, though. They all specialize on different brands, right? Yes. But out of all of this diversity, only 1.7% of those species are pests. Things that you have to worry about. But yet all of our management thinks about those, don't they? Why is dung so important? Ask an Australian. Because they imported cattle into Australia and they didn't have any dung beetles there. New Zealand too. And the poop didn't go away. It just kept on accumulating and accumulating and accumulating to the point where pastures were not useful anymore, and flies they're still really abundant. I was in Perth a few years back and it was like, oh my gosh, this is what they were talking about. They should have had more dung beetles. So they actually had a biocontrol program where they came across the world and introduced dung beetles into Australia and New Zealand in order to try to control the cattle poop. Anyways, so pasture fouling is really important. There's pest control that's aspects of it. Flies, and then these gut parasites, helminth parasites, little worms. Okay. Dung beetles are kind of the white knights, aren't they? I mean, everybody knows, well, you've got to get more dung beetles in there. They are valued, I estimate, at about $380 million annually. We should be able to update this term or this dollar figure based on 2020 data. So we're just collating the final aspects of that. Services of these dung beetles includes recycling nutrients. You get all of those nutrients. That's fertilizer. That's next year's plant's fertility, right? Increased pasture quality. It allows these areas of the fields to get grazed again, and then pest suppression. All right. But these numbers are 40 years old, so we do need to update them, okay? And we're working on that. So this is work that was done by Jacob Pachenka. He has just finished his doctorate down at Purdue, but he did his master's work on poop with me. And this was, so the pats, so we went out there and we wanted to say, okay, are dung insects actually helping to degrade poop? And so we built cages. We collected a lot of turds, and then we brought them into the lab. We froze them, and then we weighed out little 1 kilogram patties, and then we put them back out in the field, and we built little cages around them to keep all the bugs off. And this is what we found. This is not normal, okay? Insects and pats were regularly collected over 42 days to see how quickly they were degraded. This is Jacob here. So, and then what he did is we actually then collected all the insects and we we collected the pats. So we collected the turds and then we warmed them up. This was one of the stinkiest projects that we've had, all right? And then what happens is that all the bugs, they're like, oh gosh, it's getting so dry and uncomfortable in here with all this light. Let's go down. And then we collect them down here. It's called a Berlese funnel. Jacob identified 87,000 insects from poop, just in eastern South Dakota along I-29. 109 different species of insects, and only 13 of those were actually dung beetles. Isn't that interesting? Dung beetles were the minority of critters in our poop. Okay, this is a complicated graph. Essentially, this is the number of critters that are living in there, and this is the age of the turd, all right? What this is saying is that if you don't get insects on your turds within the first couple of days of them hitting the ground, you kind of miss a window, all right? And so that's a really important, that's really important for pasture management. Having a reservoir of dung insects that can quickly colonize your turds is really important. And the more insects that you have, when you exclude the insects, you end up seeing a lower you see that those dung pats degrade more slowly. Okay. Bottom line, that's your take-home message from this, in early season and in late season. So why do these guys get such a great reputation? These dung insects, huh? Why are these guys so important? They were only about 3% of the community at the maximum, right? Because the more dung beetle diversity that you have in each of these turds, the more total arthropods that you get, the more other insects. What a dung beetle is a keystone species. What they're doing and why it is that they are important on your ranches is that they are, I mean, have you guys ever played around with cow poop before? Within a little while, it gets a nice skin on the top of it. And once that skin is there, most insects can't make their way in. What dung beetles do is they open up a highway system. They're the big kind of like road workers. And they end up colonizing those paths and allowing most of the insects to access them. And that's how the dung ends up getting degraded. So it's not actually a lot of the dung beetles that are doing a lot of that work. But the dung beetles are an essential component of that community. So you want dung beetles. Conclusions. Dung bugs drive degradation rates. The fertility of your land is related to bugs, at least in part. Colonization must come early. So if you're doing things that disrupt colonization on your land, then that can really affect the persistence of those dung pads. And dung beetles are kind of this keystone species that allow it to open up. All right, pest management and dung. So ivermectins, so ivermectins, and now we're using this for COVID too, right? Ivermectin is now a treatment for COVID. Okay, what these do is these are a neurotoxin that disrupt cell membranes, especially in insect communities, okay? So they're particularly effective at disrupting the acetylcholine esterase sort of junction within insect nerves. They're very effective insecticide and nematocide, and they're poured on all kinds of different ways. Most of your animal treatments for your pets and your livestock are either neonicotinoids or ivermectins, more or less. And they're applied to the majority of cattle in the US, oftentimes prescriptively. The problem with them is that nearly all of it comes out in the poop. And it doesn't go away. Very slowly. And it kills about 98% of the insects that live in poop. And so you end up seeing dung pads that persist for years in some systems. I often get, questions about dung beetles. We don't have dung beetles in our particular fields. And the question, well, do you use ivermectins? And, oh, yeah, we do. Well, there you go. And then if they say, no, we don't, then I'm like, oh, well, then you probably have dung beetles. And maybe they're so small that you don't know it. But there is occasions when they're not there. So what causes pests? Not enough diversity, too much disturbance. We went through that, okay? So how does regenerative farming practices, that matrix that I mentioned earlier, how does that affect things like maggots and insect diversity? So when you keep your animals mobbed together, but you move them frequently, and then you allow the pasture to rest, how does that end up affecting things like insect diversity and pest abundance? We looked at 16 ranches in eastern South Dakota, and there was a range of conditions and management practices, but essentially this was the category that we ended up developing for our particular region. And these numbers can be adjusted a little bit depending on the habitat in question. And then these are the conventional ones. Animal units per acre, so low stocking density, and they were left out there basically continuous grazing, and then they were treated a lot. It's a typical cattle operation in our area. Makes for nice golf courses, but not very good for life on ranches. And then we went out there and we took golf cup cutters and we drilled into the poop And we grabbed all of these cores of all these turds from across these different management systems and looked and identified all of the beetles. For this element of the experiment, Jacob identified 116,000 insects. So all told, for his master's program, he identified to species level 200,000 insects. Not bad, not bad. About 400 insects per turd. Isn't that incredible? That is incredible. 172 different species. Species richness was significantly increased in the regenerative treatments versus the conventional. Diversity of insects was significantly increased as well. All right? But the more ivermectin we found in these turds, the fewer predators you ended up seeing, the more pests you ended up seeing. We found that pests were almost non-existent in well-managed rangelands. We've got the helminth parasite counts, and essentially, if you are using porons or any sorts of treatment on your animals, you're probably losing money. The vet's probably making money, but you're not. Okay? You can manage them by keeping the animals tight, moving them, and allowing that pasture to rest more effectively than ivermectins work. Pests are not the problem. Insecticides are an addiction. The more you use, the more you need. Who wins in an addiction scenario? It ain't the addict, right? It's the guys pushing the drugs. Change the system. How do you raise cattle without pesticides? Number one, abandon pesticides. All right, step one. High intensity grazing, frequent movement of animals, integrate herds. This is something, boy, we are looking for farms that are doing this because it isn't very common, all right? We need to be studying how animal integration and herd integration can affect things. If you ever get the chance to see Will Harris's video, 100,000 Beating Hearts, it'll change your life. It's a really good one. It's available on YouTube. He talks about that a little bit. You think you guys are dry. This is California almonds. This is the Central Valley of California. Have you guys been out there? Have you been to the Central Valley? Who's been there? Have you seen this? Not just California, but actually the Central Valley. So I'm a beekeeper, and part of this whole idea, most of the nation's bees go out to California. When they do, only 50% of the hives come back. Okay, so the bee industry in the U.S. is entirely contingent on, their business model is contingent on pollination contracts for almonds. But they have to build into that business model the fact that a good chunk of their bees are going to die. Every year this happens. So when I traveled out there, I followed the bees one year. My bees stay in South Dakota, and they die there. But we followed the bees one year, and this is what I saw. And I said, anything that I'm doing in the Midwest to help save the bees is completely negated when those bees come out to California, and we've got to be exploring this. Talked with the almond board about it. They said, soil health might work where you live, but it doesn't work in almonds. Won't work here. So we just decided to do it. And so this is Tommy. He finished his master's. He's now working in vineyards on his doctoral dissertation at UC Davis with me. It's no longer in prep. This is actually published. I can find the citation if people are interested. And essentially what Tommy did was he went out and tried to find regenerative almond producers. Folks that were using regenerative practices in their operations. And compare those to conventional neighbors that were very successful out there. This isn't photoshopped. This was actually one of our treatment contrasts. This is a conventional orchard that's very profitable, right? This is the way that it looks, and this is right across the road, right? This is one of our regenerative operations. You can see the difference. We use that matrix. Again, we use the matrix to try to define these two treatments, and the results were really staggering. So no tillage, which isn't a big thing in almond orchards, it's a perennial system, but the pesticides were, they probably spend, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars per operation per year on pesticides. Perennial ground covers are maintained. Composts are integrated in compost teas, and then some of them were even integrating livestock. And that's the alternative. Soil carbon was 30% higher on the regenerative orchards. Soil nitrogen was also significantly higher. That's important. Soil health test scores were significantly higher in the regenerative versus the conventional. This is right across the path from each other. Water. This one will change California agriculture. Water infiltration rates went in 6 times faster in the regenerative orchards. Right now, they're talking about banning, getting rid of 30% of agriculture because of their water use in the Central Valley, because it's gone, right? I mean, I don't want to, I hate to tell you, but you guys aren't far off here in Boulder County. So this is a really important issue that we've got to figure out. Regenerative folks, just by incorporating all of these regenerative practices, we're able to increase that infiltration substantially. Okay, water infiltration rates. So this is the amount of water. So this is a complicated graph, okay? So this was how fast that it went. This is seconds. How fast did it go in? So it went in 6 times faster. So less time for that water to go in, right? So it was a standard volume. In future, we have changed the way that we present that, so that's a little clearer. But we just use those NRCS test ranks, so this is something you guys can do too. There was a lot more critters, a lot more life in these farms. I mean, you could go out there and you could feel it. You could feel the difference. I mean, when you were out near Bakersfield orchards and you'd go out there, it's 100, 110 degrees out there, right? You're just baking. And then you'd go to one right down the road and it would be cool. And you could hear birds. And you could feel the life in that orchard. The difference was astounding. And we could change California's climate if we just implement some of these practices. Pest populations were exactly the same, and they were almost non-existent. And this one was an important one. We talked with one of our producers, one of the conventional producers, and we showed him the data, and he looked at it and he said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I did everything I was supposed to. I followed the university's best management practices. I followed the almond board's best management practices. And last year I sprayed 5 times. 5 insecticide applications. And what you're telling me is that the guy right across the road from me who didn't spray at all had the same number of pests. And I can't believe that. But he looked at the data and he looked at the error bars, and this was always the case. And this year, he converted 160 acres of his orchards to regenerative. And so that's the power of data, right? It wasn't just his neighbor. It's the power of science. There was no difference in yields. We can feed the world using regenerative. But the almond orchards that were regenerative were twice as profitable. And this was different than corn, though. This was based on premiums. This was based on premiums. I think that what we're going to see as these regenerative almond orchards, and we've now expanded this study substantially, like we've tripled the size of it this last year. And I think that we're going to see a consilience in methods, because right now we're kind of on the front edge, aren't we, of this regenerative movement. And there's a number of people that are, that are maybe not doing things as efficiently, but yet they're still attaining a really positive result. And so that premium is keeping them afloat, but I don't think it's necessary. Regenerative shouldn't need a premium. And even when that premium was reduced, the regenerative were just as profitable as the conventional. So you never saw like a cost hit by going regenerative, all right? And that leads us into the 1,000 Farm Initiative. So what you saw in corn and in rangelands and in almonds, oopsies, in all of those different systems, oopsies, I'm going all over the place. There it is. We are now going to try to replicate these types of experiments on 1,000 farms, doing full site inventories across the U.S. Okay, this is the largest agricultural experiment that's ever even been attempted. It crosses geographic barriers. It's really something that we've been honing ourselves for the last 6 years, developing entirely new technologies in order to unlock these communities. We don't have to change the entire planet. For nonviolent revolutions, you end up seeing that if you can turn 3.5% of a population, that's kind of a threshold number. And if you can turn that, sometimes these nonviolent revolutions end up going to fixation within a community. So we're focused on that. We think that that's a tractable number. So what questions are we asking? Number one, we are going to show, we are hoping to show, we are scientists, we will allow the data to do this for us, but our experience suggests that this is the outcome that we will observe. Well, we're hoping to show that regenerative agriculture works no matter where you live and what you grow. That farmers have developed successful systems that adhere to these regenerative principles no matter what. Okay? Number two, we are going to create roadmaps that allow transitions. So we're going to look at how farmers have attempted to transition to regenerative, and we're going to study what worked and what didn't work so that we can provide clear diagnostics for everybody to use so that it removes a lot of the risk perception associated with this. We're going to communicate our findings, and this is primarily through partnerships, and so we need this we need those partnerships. And then we're also going to monitor the outcomes. What an important aspect of this. Did it work? What ended up happening, right? And we're developing entirely new partnerships and technologies in order to measure how this works on a landscape scale. Very, very ambitious. I stay awake at night thinking about it. What have I gotten myself into? On these farms, deep carbon. My goodness, what is going on? Deep carbon, down to 60 centimeters, plus micronutrients and other aspects of the physical and chemical profiles of the soil will be conducted. Microbial communities, and we're developing new tools that will allow us to unlock those a little bit more cost effectively than PLFAs or next-gen sequencing. Invertebrate communities, we're developing new tools that will also allow us to identify these very rapidly for not just us, but for everybody. We've downloaded 700,000 images from the online in order to train our artificial intelligence systems. Really powerful. Plant communities, birds, mammals, nutrient analysis of the products, and economics. But what's really exciting about this is that this provides an experimental framework that leads to unprecedented collaborations. So as new technologies want to be calibrated across the country, we provide all of this information, not only just for the farms and the farmers, but also for people that want to develop whole new tools that can be used. Should be a really powerful framework. we've divided the country into 9 eco-regions, actually 10, because we sort of made California its own deal too. But you start to see just the scale of what we're talking about. And this all is going to be happening by 2023. We were on 250 farms or so last year. We'll be on 500 farms this year and up to 1,000 farms in 2023. I get the question of, what's it going to cost? That's great, John. You showed us all kinds of data, didn't you? You showed us all that data, and I love this idea of regenerative farming systems. I'm invested in this current system. I mean, what's it going to cost me to change, right? Am I going to lose my farm if I change? I think that's the wrong question. At this point, what's it going to cost you not to change? I think that's the more important question that we all need to be asking ourselves. Going to cost you your grandkids. Going to cost you your farm. Is it worth it? It wasn't to me. That's why I made change, right? And that's why we're doing this. Is this crazy? This idea? Is this crazy? Is it going to completely burn me out? Yeah. But at the same time, the status quo ain't working. We've got to be doing something now, okay? Now is the time for change. We've got about 10 years. Got about 10 years before we can't change the tracks anymore. The direction of the barge is just going too fast. So there it is, folks. There's a lot of hope right now. The hope lies in this room. It relies in you, all right? So please, be bold. Take an active role in this. Change your lives. Change your communities. That's where it starts. Be the pebble that starts the avalanche, right? There we are. If you'd like to learn more, you can go there. And that just disappeared. There it goes. Yep, you can keep that there. Oh, all right, waiting for questions. That's what I got. Thank you guys for listening. You guys have been such a good audience and so patient and engaged all day. So you guys are amazing. And if you're completely burned out, I totally understand. All right. Spread the word.
You're gonna get questions.
Oh, they are? Okay. What policy changes are needed to support your work? We need to get rid of crop insurance. Step 1. Needs to go. And then we need to incentivize good practices. And it needs to be systems level, not carbon focused. It needs to be systems level. If carbon subsidizations and carbon markets are the gateway drug in order to get people to start, fostering good practices, so be it. But we need to understand. We need to ask ourselves the question, can we sequester all of the carbon, all of our greenhouse gas emissions and still destroy the planet? And if the answer is yes, we're asking the wrong question. So, you.
Why did you say get rid of crop insurance, right? The first thing you said.
Crop insurance is incentivizing poor decision making. It's not allowing the innovation of our food system. So right now, if a farmer was actually profit motivated, they would not be growing corn and beans. They would be growing something else. The crop subsidization is what's supporting industrialized commodity-based agriculture. You would see a diversification of our food system if that was removed. For non-gamers. Oops. Oh, good, because I'm not a gamer either. How do you suggest we get involved and support? Change your own diet. Starts there. I think change your family's diet. Spread the word. Support it financially. The science, that's always a good thing. How do you get involved? Become a part of your food community. I think that's it. Knowing your farmer and supporting those champions that are out there that are making change in your community. There's leaders everywhere. Find them and make them the heroes that they are. Drop me an email if you would like to join the 1,000 Farm Network. If you've got a farm that you'd like included, we are recruiting actively. And so if you send me an email, we'll try to get you onto the list and we'll go from there. We're still fundraising for it too. Do dung beetles act differently with pellet dung than cattle? How can I increase dung beetles in sheep flock? Same idea as, our sheep turds don't last long on our farm. They're gone within within 2 weeks. We don't have turds on our where they've grazed, but we keep our sheep really tight and we move them every day. So yes, do dung beetles act differently with pellet dung? Yeah, they do. They're different species. So, in that sense, they're acting differently. You've got 3 different guilds. You've got rollers that roll the dung. You've seen funny videos on YouTube, no doubt, with them rolling big turds. And then they lay an egg in a burrow, and then they pile a big old turd on the baby's heads. And this is what you get to eat for your whole life. Then you've got tunnelers, that live underneath the pat. And then you've got dwellers that live in the turd. So those are the 3 kind of guilds of dung beetles. In our area, and I think it's probably true in your area, you don't have as many rollers. Is there any entomologists out there? Have you seen rollers? Yeah, do you have rollers? I'll bet they're less abundant than the other groups, though. Yeah. Most dung beetles are really small. They're like, matchstick kind of, tip of a matchstick sort of sizes. High parasite loads, woofda. Okay, things to do there. Keep them moving. Don't return them to that same spot. The disease cycle is such that that they need at least 7, or I think I'll say conservatively 10 to 14 days. And then you start to break the disease cycle. So do not put your animals back on a paddock that they've been grazed, even for a day, after 14 days. Okay, keep them moving. Next, start giving them more than grass. They need all those forbs in their diet. So a diversified pasture is really important, especially things like brassicas in their diet, really important. Get garlic into these animals. Diatomaceous earth might help too. I haven't seen science on it, but I've seen a lot of farmers using it. And then there was another thing I was going to suggest, and I can't seem to remember what that was. So, yeah. So those would be really important elements to try. That pasture rest is so important, you guys. 30 days minimum, 30 days. And then look at your regrowth before you put your animals back on. What research have we conducted in vegetable production? Not enough yet. I did one research project that was very academic, working on organic transition strategies, and one of them was a vegetable system that raised tomatoes and a couple of other vegetable crops that were involved there. Not enough yet, so that's something that we're really hoping for. We're going to be working in strawberries, in tomatoes, potatoes, We're hoping to be in sugar beets as part of 1,000 Farm. So we say, oh my gosh, 1,000 farms, you should be able to cover it. You know, by the time you replicate things, 1,000 farms ends up getting eaten up pretty quick, and especially when you're talking about the amount of effort that goes into each of these farms. These will be the best studied farms ever. I mean, like, in terms of their total, like, information that you're receiving about your operation, that's a staggering amount of information about your farm. And so we end up trying to target, you know, dominant crops in each region, right? So regionally specific dominant crops. And vegetables are almost never that. And so we end up having to kind of cherry pick, okay, we also need to look at dominant vegetable crops and dominant horticultural crops, or maybe orchard systems and stuff like that. And so we've chosen a few of them, tomatoes being one of them, potato, like those ones that I just kind of listed. So excited to be getting into that system more. How will your proposed system of regen ag scoring be verified? Organic is, GAP is. I've seen some verified. Whew. So we already did, and I would love to see, so organic, is it verified? So I went out on an earthbound farm, and I saw some of the worst soil I've ever seen in my life, and it was organic. Is it verified? It's got the stamp, checked all the boxes. And that's the problem with a label. Okay. I've seen conventional farms that are not certified organic that have wonderful soil health, that might, you know, use chemical fertilizers or something along those lines to get them by, but they understand soil health and it's a priority for them. When I compare the two, which one do I prefer? Boy, these are hard questions. How will regen ag scoring system be verified? We're the only ones that have put any data behind our regen ag scoring systems. Okay, so that's how it's going to be verified. We will continue to do that. We will continue to hone this scoring system to make it as useful as possible. And at the end of the day, we are going to give people from policymakers down to farm managers an extremely powerful tool that can be used for predicting outcomes. What incentives do you recommend to get farmers to change? If you don't change, you ain't going to be in business much longer. Do you want a farm? It's just that simple. We're living through a massive evolutionary experiment right now, right? We're selecting what species will survive on this planet within this environment that we've created. We're also selecting which people will, which industries will. Watch and learn. But we have a great answer. And we've got to be there for people when they're ready to change. So this is a win-win situation here, folks. Everybody wins with regenerative ag. Let's dump our resources into that. Do you look at the rotation or an annual year for questions on regenerative? It's within an annual year, but they have to be in their system for at least 3 years. So, and we're really interested in this rotation question. So 4,000 farms for the transition question, we're actually studying rotations. So just because, yeah, we honestly a tomato crop after tomato crop after tomato crop on a single piece of ground, that's probably not real regenerative at the end of the day. But
all right. Well, I want to thank you, John, for
you bet.
coming
Thank you,
and
guys.
your
Yep.
candidness.